I'm very curious how many people here ever met Julia? Oh, there's a few. Okay. Well, she left Oregon in '87, so you know, a lot of you did not have the opportunity, but I interviewed Julia for many hours in the mid-'80s, and again before she died in 1991. So I know a lot about her. Now, before I start talking about her, I want to look at the word proud and talk about what makes an activist proud, because that was the title, you might recall, her proudest moment. What Julia meant by it, I think, is the satisfaction of success, actually making change, achievement. That's what she found highly honorable. So tonight we'll be looking at what she thought of as her proudest achievement. Not necessarily what I think it should have been, but what she did. And I think she had many. A little bit background about her. She was born Julia Godman, 1907 in Eugene. The first child, Ella and Jack Godman, and that's her dad. He was born in Kentucky. He came west after graduating from college in Ohio and fighting in the Spanish-American War, which kind of radicalized him. He worked in bridge building and then in the timber industry, which led him to the radical union, the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies. And her father was a huge influence on her. Whoops, sorry. I went backwards instead of forward. There we go. This is the preamble to the IWWs. Julia had two lines. The first two lines she used to recite quite often. The employing class and the working class have nothing in common. There can be no peace as long as hunger and want are found among millions of working people, and the few who make up the employing class have all the good things in life. Today it would probably say the 1% and the 99. And I can assure you that Julia would have been one of the most vocal supporters of Occupy, were she with us. This is a Wobbly poster. You have the Wobbly here telling the socialists, the communists, the anarchists, and Sky Pilot, I think they mean religion. He's got a little halo on him. That instead of looking to the sky, they should be organizing. The IWW believed in one big union, an industrial union, organizing all workers, skilled, unskilled, women, children, migrants, all races, bottom to top. It was in stark contrast to the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, which had been around since the 19th century, but they were interested in skilled craft workers. The woman on the right, the far right, is Ella, and believe me, that's the only time in her life she was on the far right. This is her high school picture. She was a socialist. And Julia was little too. Julia was about 5'1". Her mother was a very important influence as well. You know, I know her father was, but so was her mom. When Julia was very small and really too young to know what was going on, her mother used to drag her along on suffrage marches, because Julia was 5.5 when suffrage came in. And she also went door to door, her mom did, distributing illegal birth control information. I mean, it was all illegal at that time. And Julia went along on that. So it's not a big surprise that Julia grew up to be an activist too. She was mostly homeschooled. Her mother made her write a great deal. She became a writer of poetry, fiction, journalism. Essays, yeah. She wrote all kinds of things. And this is a poem. Maybe. It's not really important if you can read it or not. But it was published, she was taking a college correspondence class, and they published it in their, this publication that the correspondence classes did. But she'd also had, that's the end of it, she'd also had poems published in her high school annual. Even though she only went to high school for a very short time, she said she got thrown out for arguing politics in class with her teachers, disagreeing with the teacher's take on things. And I want to talk about Julia's names just a little bit, because she had a lot of them and can get confusing. That's why I'm going to call her Julia throughout, because she was born Julia Godman. She had 3 married names: Julia Bertram. Well, these are the 3 I'm going to use. She actually had a 4th husband, but he's not really mentioned in the story. She was very young. Julia Bertram, Julia Eaton, and then Julia Ruttila. And then she had her primary pen name. I think she might have had some others, but the one she used the most was Kathleen Cronin. So you'll see that in the byline on some of the clippings that I'm going to show you tonight. I'll try to remind you when they come up, but I might forget. So anyway, what was her proudest moment? I'm not going to tell you yet. I'm going to tell you some other candidates, and we're going to save the winner for last. Okay, back in 1932, Congress passed the Norris-LaGuardia Act, even before the New Deal, which sharply limited the use of injunctions against peaceful picketing. And then, in '33, after FDR was in, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the New Deal, the National Industrial Recovery Act came in, and that guaranteed workers the right to organize and engage in collective bargaining, and it also barred employers from interfering with an employee's choice of labor organizations. That's important, because there used to be sort of company unions that they would put in to, say, well, we've got a union, but it wasn't really. And it also created the National Labor Board to mediate labor disputes, and then that relatively soon turned into the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, which we still have today. In Detroit, these laws fueled the creation of the UAW. In Oregon, it was the timber industry that, quote, accounted for, quote, nearly 1/2 of the productive income, employment, and payroll, unquote, in Oregon at that time. So timber workers, including those in sawmills, took notice. Oops. Oh, okay. And this is the mill, West Oregon Lumber Company, where Julia was living in a company house with her husband Butch and her son Mike, Butch Bertram, who was working at that mill. This is some of the housing, but it looks a lot nicer than what Julia described to me. Julia called it a shack, and she said they shared common walls, so the sound was really bad. So I think this is maybe some of the nicer housing they had for people. The AFL had been around since the 19th century, but as I mentioned, they were interested in craft unions, organizing workers with particular skills into a union. So just like all the carpenters or all the electricians in a plant. And there was another idea about unions, that you should organize the whole workplace, the whole industry, so everybody was together and everybody could go out and strike together, everybody could support each other. And after these laws were passed, there was a great deal of pressure on the AFL to organize these workers that they hadn't organized before, the so-called unskilled workers. I just hate calling them that, because I don't think they're unskilled. I think they have a lot of skills to work in a factory and not get yourself killed. Anyway, the AFL, because they were getting so much pressure from these workers, they started what they called federal unions, and they would charter them directly to the international union. And a few men at the West Oregon Mill were trying to recruit for this federal union, but Butch was a wobbly. And that's where had been, you know, and that's where Julia sympathies were, of course, too. And so they were very wary of the AFL, and they said, you know, and Julia said there were only about 10 people had signed up. It's a big mill, a few hundred workers. And then the longshoremen, all up and down the West Coast, went on strike. 1934. They were striking for union recognition. It's really remarkable to read the papers from those years, the mid-30s. There is just strikes and labor strife all over the country. Workers were just organizing like crazy. In the Bay Area, this 34 strike led to the deaths of 2 men who were shot by police on July 5th, 34, and then to a general strike in response to that. In Portland, a week later, 4 strikers who were sitting on the train tracks to prevent trains going into the terminal with scabs on it were shot. None of them were killed, but a couple of them were pretty seriously injured. After this happened, Julia decided to go down there and see what was going on. And she came back from convinced that it was industrial war and she and Butch belonged in it, AFL or not. And so she persuaded Butch to get involved, and they started working to get that union at the mill. And it took a year, but they got a union by 35. And then once they had the union, Julia decided she had to organize a ladies' auxiliary, which she did, and she was the head of it. This is kind of interesting. This is the Timber Workers, the union's newspaper. You can see, here's the one about Oregon, and Julia's, I think that's her there, mentions her. And here's the Aberdeen women. Here's the women in Elma. Here's the women in Seattle. So it was going on everywhere. Pretty exciting. Eventually, the AFL turned the federal union over to the carpenters union. That was the idea. You'd organize them and then you'd parcel them out. Well, the carpenters, they considered themselves much higher than these sawmill workers. And the sawmill workers soon found that they were very second-class members in this union. They went to their convention and they weren't given a voice or a vote. So in 1937, that's only 2 years after they were founded, they left the AFL for a home. Oops. Oh, yeah. Okay, forgot this slide, sorry about that. This is the carpenters. They're not happy with the ladies' auxiliary. And as you can see, they didn't want to let Julia and her compatriot into their meeting. So they decided they would join the CIO. The CIO was much more congenial to industrial union, and had an election. This is one of the election places. There's the ballot box. And the CIO was chosen. And to some of you younger people, it might seem really weird to hear that the AFL and the CIO were at odds with each other, because they did merge in 1955. But earlier, they were quite rivals, and actually in the 30s, it was virtual war. One example, here in Portland, in August 1937, the AFL Teamsters attacked 4 fuel trucks and dumped their loads in the street because they came from CIO mills. And the fuel we're talking about is sawdust, a big mill waste product that had been made useful in many people's homes. Furnaces were made to do sawdust. So it's a pretty big mess, the loss of that sawdust, that fuel. The shots were fired, car wires were pulled. It was quite the event. So, the next week, this is my favorite new picture that I found, I have to confess. The next week, Julia called on the Ladies Auxiliary to ride shotgun on the fuel and lumber trucks. And there's Julia, right up there. They're obviously on a lumber truck, this one, but they were going on both. Huh? Yeah. Shortly, however, the CIO was locked out. The mills really preferred, if they were going to have a union, that it be the more conservative AFL. And at West Oregon, they were locked out for 8.5 months. And Julia used to say that's a long time for a family to do without a paycheck, especially when the union's new and it doesn't have a strike fund yet. The men could cross the picket line and renounce the CIO and they'd be able to work, and a handful did. But the vast majority held out, and not in small part because of the work of the Ladies Auxiliary. You can see here, I mean, the Ladies Auxiliary and are behind these kids, but I mean, they're there with them. But it's the lumber and sawmill workers. This I'm just showing you, this is actually from the ILWU Auxiliary, and it's from the 70s, I think, yeah, 72. And Julia was in that union then. That's how I came by this bulletin, and I don't have anything comparable from the IWA's auxiliary. But this is the kind of, one of the ways that the Ladies Auxiliary was important and helped out during a strike. It gives you somewhat an idea. Julia's Auxiliary ran a clothing depot during the lockout, and the union gave out groceries, and later they had to open a soup kitchen. And the women went around and begged food and money to keep these things going. But because they didn't have much money, people started getting, I could keep them fed a little bit, but they started getting their utilities turned off and evicted. So this was the Depression. A lot of people were unemployed. Oregon had an organization, and I think there were a lot of them around the country, of unemployed workers, called the Oregon Workers Alliance. Julia had heard they had luck in getting people's utilities turned back on. So she went to the Oregon Workers Alliance for advice, and they said, you have to go to the welfare office, take your children, and sit in, they'll listen. And they went, about 50 of them, and she said, you know, they did talk to them. You know, after a while, they were kind of noisy and stuff out there with all those children in the office. They got their water turned back on, but they still really needed to eat. So they went back to the Workers Alliance, and they advised them to bring all their kids, all their men, all their members, and march around the courthouse. And they got 5,000 people marching around the county courthouse. And what they were asking for was welfare. And after a couple hours, they called them in, they had a conference, and they all went home that day on welfare. Wow. And that really won the battle for them, because they could, you know, they could live. They also decided they should not be bringing more babies into the world when they could barely afford to feed the ones they had. So Julia got a woman doctor to come speak on birth control. And this was something women knew nothing about, most of them. And this woman came, this doctor, her name was Lena Cannon, and she advocated the use of diaphragms. And that was fine, except diaphragms have to be fitted. And she volunteered to fit a few women, but that wouldn't do it. There were a lot of them. So they decided they needed to go up to the medical school and ask the medical school to help them. The problem up there was that the head of the medical school was Catholic. So they had to sit down up there as well, won that battle, and then they had to go fight with welfare to pay for them, and they won all those battles. The power of the many. Finally, they did win after 8.5 months their NLRB hearing, in all but one of the mills, and so they got to keep their CIO union. It was called the International Woodworkers of America. Julia was the only person with a typewriter during this. So it was only natural. She's the one that typed everything up. And that led her to writing for the woodworkers newspaper, the Timber Worker. And she eventually became the Oregon editor. Now, I mentioned that she liked to write fiction, and in fact, while she was living in this sawmill town, she wrote a novel set there, which I'm hoping to get published soon, relatively soon. Anyway, she would write these little short stories. This is the whole story here. And she would publish them in the Timber Worker along with the news. And they were always very pro-union or anti-scab. This one is anti-1%. It's how extravagant Mrs. Vincent Astor is with her perfume. This one is about a Christmas present. It was, as you can see, right before Christmas that it got published. So this man is Ray Becker. Julia had known about Ray Becker since she was a little girl because her father had very bad arthritis, and he would ask her to write letters to Ray Becker because Ray Becker was in prison and Ray Becker was a wobbly. So she knew about him. He'd been arrested in 1919 along with other wobblies in Centralia, Washington. Centralia was in the middle of lumber country, and timber was very big business there. In the West, the IWW was focused on organizing the lumber industry. So the businessmen in Centralia did not like the IWW, and in 1918, a mob raided their hall in Centralia and threw them out of town. And they had the audacity, the Wobblies, to return in the fall of 1919 and rent a new space down the street from their former hall. Within a month, the town's businessmen, led by F.B. Hubbard, the president of the Eastern Railroad and Lumber Company. Oh, I had all these pictures of Centralia I was supposed to be showing you. Okay, I'll show you. There's the mill. Okay, there's F.B. Hubbard's Eastern Railway and Lumber Company. Isn't that gorgeous? He was very rich and very powerful in town. And he and the people he convinced to join him formed the Centralia Citizens Protective Association. And this is a quote, to combat IWW activities in this vicinity, unquote. Then the American Legion announced they were going to have a parade for the first Armistice Day on November 11th. This is 1919. The war had ended in 1918, November 11th. And the Protective Association then formed a secret action committee. And they held a meeting at the Elks Club, this great big building right in the center of Centralia. Their main park is right over here. It's kind of a town square. And by early November, they were talking openly in Centralia about the fact that there was going to be a raid on the IW hall. And the local wobbly organizer, of course, heard about it, and he went to the only lawyer in Centralia who was sympathetic, and that lawyer said, you've got a right to defend your property. So along comes the Armistice Day Parade. Here's a little map of the main street, and they are marching down Tower. Here's where the IWW hall is. And the parade comes, and it stops right in front, and someone is heard to say, go get 'em, boys. And at least three men ran up to the door and started to break it down to the hall. Well, the Wobblies, I'm not sure, definitely, whoops, sorry about that. Definitely inside the hall, they were armed. There are others who say that they were also in the Arnold Hotel and the Avalon Hotel with guns. And in any case, there's great dispute to this day who did what first. But there was a lot of shooting, and 3 of the American Legionnaires knocking on that door were shot, and they all died by evening. There was a mob that then started around town arresting people, Wobblies, and several of them had hid inside the hall, and they got them quite quickly. A man named Wesley Evers, to Wobbly, he ran out the back door and he got chased into the nearby river. Swift current, he can't swim, it was relatively common back then. He turns and he shoots his closest pursuer, which turns out to be town hero and head of the American Legion. They drag Evers to jail. The 21 other Wobblies there already. Throw him in the jail. He's beaten up pretty badly. He's lying on the floor of the cell, the holding cell. But that night, the lights go out in Centralia, and a mob breaks into the jail. They drag Wesley Evers out, and they lynch him. And they shoot him a bunch of times too, and then they say it was suicide. This is the Sentinel. It's in that park right across from the Elks Club. It's in the center of Centralia, and on the back of this monument, these are 2 of the guys that were killed. On the back it says, "To the memory of Ben Casagrande, Warren O'Grim, Ernest Dale Hubbard, Arthur McElfresh, slain on the streets of Centralia, Washington, Armistice Day, November 11th, 1919, while on peaceful parade, wearing the uniform of the country they loyally and faithfully served." And for nearly 70 years, that was the only commemoration of this event in Centralia. It was not taught in the schools. It was not talked about. The books were not in the library. Many, many books were written about it, but you couldn't find out about them in Centralia. And then, in 1997, an international political muralist, Mike Alowitz, came to Centralia and he painted this mural. It's called The Resurrection of Wesley Evers. And take a good look at this part of the building, because this building, this is the former Elks Hall, overlooking the park and the Sentinel. So back to the trial. There were 10 Wobblies indicted for murder for one of the Legionnaires that got shot at the hall, and they indicted the lawyer too. It is one of the most kangaroo courts I've ever read about. Witnesses for the defense were threatened and told what to say beforehand by the Legionnaires. Some who persisted in testifying for the defense were arrested for perjury. Prosecution attorneys coached at least one witness with the prosecutor in attendance. The jury wasn't allowed to visit the scene. They were told a large band of Wobblies were hiding in the hills to make them scared. So the jury found 7 guilty of second-degree murder. They let the lawyer off, hoping that he could work to free them. And they signed a petition for leniency, thinking that the defendants would get 2 to 5, but they got 25 to 40. This is Ray Becker right here, in the front middle. There were several jurors. This is an article Julia put in the Timber Worker later in the 30s when she was trying to get Ray out. But there were several jurors who started working to free them because they really had felt that they had to find them guilty. One of them said people had died. They were afraid more people would die if they found them innocent like themselves. One of the prisoners died in prison in 1930, and 5 were paroled in the early 30s. And that left only one man left in the prison, Ray Becker. This is when he became a trustee, so I don't know who these other guys are. So Ray had refused parole. That's why he was still there. He wanted vindication. He wanted a new trial. Over the years, he had several committees formed to try to get him out. But I have to say, he was very hard to work with. And by 1934, only the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, was still involved. So as soon as the mills were organized, Julia started thinking, boy, there's a lot of ex-Wobblies in this union. Maybe I could get them to organize. And she started the Free Ray Becker Committee. She got the Woodworkers Union, the IWA, behind her, and she recruited a committee with educators, lawyers, labor unions. This is S.P. Stevens on the right, Ray on the left. S.P. Stevens had been a Wobbly, and now he was an officer in the Firefighters Union. And she made him the chairman, and she was the secretary. Starting in '36, she started writing articles in the Timber Worker. Here's one you can see is by Julia Godman. That's really interesting. I've not seen her use that name because she was definitely Bertrand by then. And she wrote a lot of articles. This is one saying buy buttons to raise money. The committee raised money to hire lawyers, and also, this one says it's by S.P. Stevens, but I think it's probably written by Julia. She just liked to put different names on them. They also were paying travel expenses of investigators. Julia was the principal one. She traveled around collecting affidavits from jurors and from witnesses. These affidavits are all up at the Oregon Historical Society in the archives. And they are amazing. They're really fascinating. I have read every one, and there's huge stacks. There were ones taken earlier by earlier committees, and then these ones taken in the 30s. They tell quite a story. They hired a lot of lawyers. This is Irv Goodman on the right in this picture, and Ray on the left. Ray's gained a little weight. And Ray is one of the lawyers, one of many that the Free Ray Becker Committee hired, because Ray kept firing them. Remember Irv, because he's going to come back several times. He became a very close friend of Julia's. Finally, Julia and S.P. Stevens went to see Washington's lieutenant governor. They showed him some of the affidavits. Some of these people talked about in the affidavits were now people who were in power in Washington, were in this legislature, were big businessmen. And they told him that they had more and that they were going to make them public, and a lot of heads would roll. And it wasn't too long after that, September 20th, 1939, Ray Becker, sentence was reduced to time served, 18 years and 3 months. Counting, however, the time he was in jail from his arrest, it was only 2 months shy of 20 years. There he is actually leaving the prison. Looks pretty happy. Those people in the back are two people from Seattle who had worked on various committees to get him out. I think the woman on the left, Mary Farquharson, was the ACLU. Here's another picture from that same period of that one that was up before the program started. This was taken in 1942. And the reason I wanted to stick this here is, you see that bracelet on Julia's wrist? Ray Becker made that. Ray learned a whole lot of hand skills when he was, handicraft skills when he was in prison, and he supported himself after he got out doing leather work. He had a little shop in Vancouver. And sadly, he died when he was only 56 in 1950. Okay, now we're going to skip ahead to 1948. Julia's been divorced and married and divorced again. Her name's now Julia Eden. She's a single mom, and she's working as a secretary. It's a civil service job at State Public Welfare. She's been working there since '43. On the side, she's working for Federated Press, which is a left-leaning labor and farm news service. She's getting $15 a month plus expenses. And she's taken the pen name Kathleen Cronin now, because she knew she'd get in trouble. This is Vanport at its height. It was the largest wartime housing development in the country. It was built to house shipyard workers. It was located where it's now West Delta Park, Portland International Raceway, and Heron Lake Golf Course. It was built, really quickly and meant to be temporary, so it was relatively flimsy, but it was also a model plan city. Uh-oh, come on. Don't do that to me. Okay. Here's some of the housing. There were detached houses as well, but these are the apartments. Here's some interiors. These are all publicity shots done to brag about what a great place it is. Public lounges. They had an infirmary, a hospital. The only thing that's really left from this period of Vanport and the shipyards, the heritage, is Kaiser Health System, because it was the health system for the workers. They paid, I believe, $1 a month was their fee. They had a cafeteria. You worked 7 days a week. This was, they had round-the-clock shifts, so it really helped to have good cafeterias. People didn't have time to cook. They had daycare center. This is the plan for, they had more than one of these, but they were completely enclosed. The children could play inside and couldn't get in trouble, out into traffic. There's one of the daycare centers. These operated 24 hours a day too, because mothers worked all shifts. This picture is a little bit misleading because it was definitely, it had all races there, but it was segregated within, Julia told me, within the project. So this shows you see, yeah, I think you can see, it was really a very, very complete city. It had, but it wasn't really a city. It had no government. It was the Portland Housing Authority managed it, and there was everything except bars. No bars. And here is where the dike broke. May 30th, 1948. There'd been 40,000 people living at the height of the war, at the height of the shipyard building at Vanport, and they were down to 18,000, but that was because people couldn't move out because there were terrible housing shortage still. Wow. And so there were still 18,000 people there the day that it broke. They could see it was leaking, but the housing authority assured them that everything was fine, not to worry. They'd given plenty of notice, and they didn't. So you can see people are getting out basically with maybe a little suitcase. Mostly the clothes on their backs. A lot of them had to be rescued by boat. And 15 people at least did not get out. They died. These cars did not get out. Julie had been working on a feature story about Vanport, and she knew there's going to be a flood. And as soon as she heard about it, she was out there. She wrote a series of highly critical articles. She wasn't the only one that was critical. They didn't rehouse the people very well. So they had this citizens committee got formed. It's an open letter to the flood victims telling them the demands that are being made to the mayor and the city. Here's a demonstration going on. Their demands included immediate money grants to victims, housing and auto courts, and vacant hotel rooms. Julia said they didn't want to get them the vacant hotel rooms because it was just before Rose Festival. They wanted them for tourists. And that they wanted jobs repairing flood damage. The letter reminds them we're only going to get what we struggle for. So Julia wrote this series of articles, and unfortunately, this was bound, and you can't really, it says flood victims get pitiful dole. She said that the welfare said it was a national disaster, so they cut off the people that were on welfare. About a third of the people were on, fourth of the people were on welfare. And the welfare said Red Cross should feed them because it was a national disaster, and the Red Cross said that they'd only help the people who haven't been on welfare. So it was really a mess for these people. And Julia, the article was for Federated Press, which was a news service, and so it was a kind of left news service. So AFL and CIO papers carried it, but also the People's World and the Daily Worker, and some independent dailies and farm papers. And the People's World and the Daily Worker were published by the Communist Party. And I know most people think of the 50s as when the Red Scare started, but it was already going on in 48. And Julia said she knew she was writing her death warrant when she wrote these articles, but she felt when you had a press card, you had to do it. So she wrote them under Kathleen Cronin, but they figured out who she was, and they fired her on 20 minutes notice. Now I have to tell you, it's not just the articles that she wrote. She did some other things that they also used as excuses for getting rid of her. She got a lot of press coverage because it was civil service, and she was a permanent employee, so she did get a hearing down in Salem. And Irv Goodman went down there with her, represent her at no charge. She was really broke. She had a large defense committee, a lot of union people, some people who'd lost their homes in Vanport. The governor said it was a red mob descending on the state capitol for her hearing. She said she was fired for political reasons, mainly the articles, her membership in the Progressive Party, and for trying to organize a union. Irv said that the commission had failed to follow civil service regulation, requiring 10 days dismissal notice, and they hadn't shown she was guilty of any of the legal reasons that you can discharge somebody on civil service. Okay, this is a quote. These are the grounds: misconduct, inefficiency, incompetency, insubordination, indolence, malfeasance, and other unfitness to render effective service. So welfare admitted they fired her because her activities and public utterances, that's a quote, had reflected upon and embarrassed them. And that they cited her attendance at the demonstrations. We had that picture of, for City Aid for the flood victims, her articles critical of the Welfare Commission, and her part in a protest at a school board meeting when a communist wasn't allowed to speak. One of the social workers did testify on her behalf, but I'm sure it's no surprise that she lost. And that was the last full-time job she ever had. She was 41 years old. She went to work as a secretary for the ILWU, the International Longshore Warehouse Union, and she continued doing her journalism. So it's really time for the break. Okay, I'm gonna let you go, have a beer, see you back. Okay, can I get you to, thank you. Can I get you to sit down and get going again? This man up here is Oscar Ruttila, where she got the name Ruttila. Really wonderful man of Finnish descent. She married him in 1951. He worked at the Pillsbury Flour Mill warehouse in Astoria, and he was active in his union, the ILWU. The W stands for warehouse. And that's how Julia met him, because that was a union she worked for too. She was wrote for them, and she was secretary there. She moved to Astoria after she married him, and she loved it there, and she loved the Finnish community. Oscar was active in the Communist Party, but it was Julia who was subpoenaed by the House Committee on Un-American Activities, better known as HUAC, in 1956. Julia liked to think it was for her reporting that got HUAC's attention, and the work she'd done trying to defeat Astoria's Republican congressman. The committee did confront her with a lot of copies of stories that had been picked up from Federated Press by the Communist Press, and I think she wrote for the People's World, sometimes directly too. But in fact, she was one of 9 Oregonians subpoenaed by HUAC hearings in Seattle to investigate the communist political subversion. more particularly the committees for the protection of foreign-born. The committees were working to protect the protection of foreign-born, primarily working to stop the deportation of foreign-born union activists. This is a really terrible period. It's become known as the McCarthy era, but the reality is, after Senator Joe McCarthy, who chaired the committee in the Senate that was comparable to HUAC, but it was much more than McCarthy. I mean, it's obviously, this House committee had nothing to do with the Senate. One of the cases that the committee had been working on was that of Hamish McKay, shown here with his children. The family, they lost this one, and the McKays were deported to Canada, including the American-born sons. McKay had lived here for more than 30 years. So Julia and a bunch of, number of other ILWU people associated with it went to Seattle for these hearings. This is Julia being sworn in. Like so many people who were testifying against their will, Julia took the Fifth Amendment, the protection against self-incrimination, frequently, although she really wanted to take the First Amendment, but her lawyers said no, the First Amendment is freedom of the press. This is the beginning of the transcripts. Here's where it starts for Julia. You'll notice she's accompanied by two lawyers. One of them is Frank Posey. He's going to come up later, so that's why I'm pointing him out. Anyway, she's in here. She's already taken the fifth over here. But there was one little part she was kind of proud of. And this was this little section. Can you read it? Did you approve the actions of the communists in Hungary? This is 1956. The Hungarian people, part of the Soviet Union, they had started to come up with some of their own democratic reforms, and the Soviet came in with tanks and put it down. So they're asking her, did she approve of what the communists did in Hungary? And Julia says, which communists? Because of course the Hungarians were communists too. And she was very, very proud of that response. This is not her proudest moment, but that's why I included it here, because she was very proud of that. I have a feeling, however, that the committee didn't even get it. This is some of the coverage afterwards. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to 1975. Julia was 67. Unfortunately, she was a widow. She had a really happy marriage with Oscar. It was really sad when he died after only about 10 years together. She was living alone in a little house in North Portland, Montana Street. This period was marked by inflation and recession. And Julia was still writing for the Longshore paper. She's getting Social Security, but she didn't have much money. And she was feeling the pinch, but I think she also got involved in this just because she was political. Now the reason that I have this picture up here is because this is something she did with her friend Martina Engel Curl. Martina was an artist, and this is a piece of Martina's art. Martina, this is a print, and it's called Storm in the Hop Yard. Martina grew up in Oregon, very poor, and her family were farm workers a lot of the time, including herself. Anyway, Pacific Power and Light, PP&L, changed their name to Pacific Power, but then it was PP&L. They applied for a rate increase, and they just had one the year before. So they started organizing against this. And Martina and Julia decided that they were going to go sit in. It was supported. There was an organization, but they were the two of them. They were both 67 or 68. They went in and they spent the day in the PP&L office. Julia's sitting on a sleeping bag. Martina's just sitting on something she's folded up, maybe, I don't know what. And they sat there and they said they weren't going to leave because it was the first time they'd been warm and they couldn't afford to heat their houses. So PP&L tolerated them for the whole day, but at closing time they called the cops. That's Julia being carried out. Martina wasn't sitting on a blanket, so they had to drag her. The cop was very embarrassed dragging Martina. He said to her, "Can't you walk? Look how bad you're making me look." And this was, 75, 60 wasn't so long ago. Martina said, "You do your thing, I'll do mine." They were taken to jail. They were released on their own recognizance. PP&L dropped the charges. Great press coverage. They were in the Oregonian, they were in the Journal, they were in the Columbian. I read the chapter that I wrote on this at a writer's colony nearly 20 years after the event, and a woman there at the writer's colony was from Salem, and she remembered seeing it on TV in Salem. So they really got good coverage. A month later, the organizing was still going on. This is something to get people out for a hearing on the electric rates. We still have those hearings now. They got 150 people out, testified, but the hike was permitted. However, most of it went, the bulk of it, 46%, up to 46% for industrial. Residential, an average of 5%, but that's still a lot, and they just had one the year before. This was Julia's last arrest, and what she said about this was that she learned that she could do anything she wanted now because she was too old to get beat up. Okay, this says Sauvie Island on it. But when I moved to Portland, and when this story was going on, we all called it Sauvie's Island, and that's what it's going to be in this next little thing. In October of 1944, the Central Labor Council, at their meeting, discussed the fact that the city of Portland was paroling workers out to a farm on Sauvie's Island to build barracks, and they thought they should be getting the work. They thought union workers should be building, union carpenters and other union building trade people. And the complaint reached the city, and the mayor asked Judge Quillen, who was the guy paroling these people to the farm, to make a report. And after he read the report, the mayor said it wasn't a problem. So the next year, the Central Labor Council went and got a lawyer. And by the end of the year, both the county, Multnomah County, and the state bars were investigating this practice, the whole subject of Portland's parole system. It was early '46 when Irv Goodman, you remember him, the lawyer, asked Julia to investigate, and they went out there with a clergyman, the three of them, to take a look. Now, this was, there was no bridge until the very end of 1950. There was a ferry or a boat to get to Sauvie Island in those days. So it was pretty isolated. This is Tony Fazio. He's the farmer. He's the middle of this story. He had two big truck farms. One was out by the airport near Northeast 47th, it was about 400 acres. And then he had 800 acres, over 800 on Sauvie's Island. He had about 200 workers, and at times, up to 65 of them were parolees. At first, he housed them on the farm by the airport and trucked them out to the island. But in '44, he had them build a dormitory. And there he is with the dormitory they're building. he paid his workers, his parolee workers, $2.50 a day, plus room and board. And out of that, he would pay their fine to the court. He would buy them work clothes if he needed them. He would sell them tobacco and give them, if there was anything left when their term was up, then he'd give them the money. But that was not the going wage. So Julia and Irv and the clergyman visited, and they said, Julia said they'd been making a big deal out of this being very healthy conditions out there. Here's some of the, this is some, a sympathetic reporter did some pictures, covered this story. This cook says he's happy. These are the men in the evening recreating. This is Tony Fazio talking to the men, explaining the work to them. Julia was not a sympathetic reporter, which I think is probably not a surprise to you. She thought conditions were deplorable. And she said that when she talked to the men, they told her if their term was up and what they were doing out there, building, wasn't finished, they would maybe hide some contraband in their cot and then tell them they had to stay longer. So at the county courthouse, Julia discovered that Fazio had bought the land from a city commissioner who later voted for the appointment of the judge. And that Fazio had been farming the land at least a year before he bought it. And this was published in this, that was part of the illustration for the story that Julia published in the People's World. She found that there were that the farmers on the island, the other farmers, were very resentful, especially because in '44, Fazio had put a guardhouse up and a guard on the ferry and was searching people, and they complained, and then the judge did stop that. But they were cooperative with her and talked to her. And this was an editorial in the Oregonian in March of '46, and the Grange sent a letter to the editor, printed a few days later, in response. And I'm going to read you just a little bit from it. Not as much as I would have liked to, because I'm going way over. During the past 2 years, the Tony Fazio Prisoners Farm on Sauvy's Island has been extolled by feature articles in the press. Portland Central Labor Council has voiced mild criticism from the standpoint of labor. Montgomery Bar Association has a preliminary report suggesting the system is illegal. And now your editorial, working for Tony, says more facts are needed. Despite all the attention that these approximately 50 farm families were getting, they really felt ignored. They complained about it being a penal colony. They said escaped prisoners were knocking at their doors, wanting to know how to get off the island. And actually, 8% of the prisoners did disappear and disappeared. And they felt strongly, they said that, I'm going to quote again, if rehabilitation of these unfortunates is to be the real motive and not simply an easy way out by the city and cheap labor and considerable profit to Fazio, then the city should meet the issue and provide itself with a farm under public supervision. Peonage, serfdom, or slavery, voluntary or otherwise, should not be tolerated in any form. And Julia, I want to read you a little bit from her. 2 months later, Julia published that article, her article. And I want to read it to you for two reasons, just a little bit of it. It's 6,000 words long. And this is the very beginning of it. It had a banner headline, and it took up about half of the front page, and then it continued inside. But I want you also to get a flavor of her writing, a little bit purple prose. Behind him was the swamp, before him the dark and swirling waters of the tidal river. He was afraid of the river with its unknown reaches, lost in the unfriendly night. But the memory of long hours of forced labor in the fields and the armed overseers drove him on. Muttering a prayer, he plunged in. This was not French Guiana in 1888, nor one of the chain gangs of the Deep South at the turn of the century. This was Multnomah County, Oregon, 1944. The escapee was 17. He'd been sentenced to hard labor on Tony Fazio Farm on Savi's Island for a petty misdemeanor that elsewhere would carry with it the penalty of a few days in jail or a small fine. So he got to the Secretary of Central Labor Council. That's how they found out about it, apparently, maybe initially. There was quite a fight. A lot of people got involved. Irv Goodman got involved. The Bar Association, etc. And the Oregon State Bar in April had a 2-day hearing on the practice. And here's where we get the city commissioner being the silent partner. This is Julia's article still. Oregon's penal colony, as far as the writer can find out, is the only one in the United States which is privately owned. And that is what the Bar Association in there, they asked all over the country. They didn't find any other situation like this. So, Julia wrote this story. The Bar Association came out with their report. Here's an interesting part. They are not free to work at the going wage, which for agricultural labor ranges from this is the time, 75 cents per hour for Mexican nationals and 90 cents per hour for other help. They said that the judge would throw the book at people who were okay for Tonys, meeting out 90-day sentences for first offenders. And this, it started in '42 during the war when there was a labor shortage. So, the fact that he would go and pay fines for people and get them out so he could have labor, you could understand it. I'm not defending it, but you can understand why he wanted them. But this was after the war already. Anyway, after the bar, so then the bars comes out, and they say that that people were asking to go there, but the bar says individual signing such a request is about to be sentenced and is not in a position to object to enforced servitude. Later that month, Melvin McGrawn was arrested for absconding from the farm, and he sued for habeas corpus. And in September, the judge ruled in his favor, finding that paroling of prisoners for work purposes was illegal. And the same week, the Oregon Bar Association's Committee on Portland's Parole Systems report came out, and they called for a halt to the practice too. They thought that the parole function should be removed from the court and that we should have a parole officer. We had no parole officers then. And they recommended the setting up of a prison farm. So that should have been the end of the story. But then, in 1949, we had a new deputy city attorney, Frank Posey. Now, we saw him 7 years later. He's a private attorney, and he's actually works for the ILWU, and he was representing Julia up at HUAC. But here, he was just out of law school, and he'd taken a job as the deputy city attorney. And he discovered he got sent to court, to represent indigent clients, and he met some of these guys that had just been released from Fazio's farm. And so he opened it up and saw that it was happening again. He started investigating it. He uncovered that people were sentenced to 6 months if they could go to Tony, and they were basically just alcoholics, guys getting picked up for being drunk or indigent. And they would be taken from the city jail to the county jail, and the next day Fazio would come pick them up to work on the farm. And here's a little bit of what Posey told me about 40 years later. The farm on Savi's Island was several miles down the island. I think it was way up at the far end where there really aren't even roads hardly. They got board and room. They bought their Durham tobacco and things from them. I recall you could buy Bull Durham for a nickel, but they were charged 10 cents. That stays in my mind. They got these, mind you, these are alcoholics, winos. They received a jug of wine a week. Fazio would have written, he would have written, this is still Posey, he'd have written releases from the judge. There were only 2 judges that could do this. So one or both of them were writing them. He got affidavits from several people. He said, I did it because something was wrong. I submitted it to city attorney. In the meantime, the newspapers picked up on the rumors. Somebody broke into his desk and jimmied it, and especially the Oregon Journal. Quotes appeared in the journal. So it came out, and everybody started investigating it again. He said there were a lot of people involved, but he wasn't interested in getting anybody. He was just interested in getting it stopped. So we did get a parole system out of this, so that was very good. I said to Posey, he said when this arose, Julia came to me. She wanted to know the whole story because she'd written about it. And I said she was very proud of her story. That's the story she held up as her shining hour as an investigative reporter, because she felt she had a role in really changing something. And Posey said, I think she did, initially. The story got a lot of press, and the practice was finally stopped. I don't think they ever started a prison for him. I don't know. It was, they did put some money aside, $30,000, the city did, but I don't know that they ever did anything. So I call this Julia's proudest moment. A change actually happened. I don't know that Julia was really the one that did it, but that was what she thought. She used to say, looking back over my misspent life, the only fight I ever won was stopping peonage on Sabi's Island. So that's her proudest moment. I've just got a little bit I want to tell you about the rest of her story. A year after her arrest at PP&L in 1976, this is, she was in the hospital from flu, and she had asthma, so it was really complicated. And the hospital social worker wouldn't let her go back to her house, said she couldn't live alone anymore. So she moved into Marshall Union Manor, which is a union-run retirement apartment house in Northwest Portland. And she ended up being the newsletter editor there. And she managed to get some politics in from time to time. She was almost 70 then. She regularly argued with the management. She was always complaining to me because he would make her get permission to set up a table when she had a petition that she wanted people to be signing. And she was also the Democratic Precinct Committee woman for the building and for the surrounding area. She continued working for the Dispatcher. She did not retire until she was 80. This is her retirement party. And it's at the ILWU Union Hall. It says, so long, it's been good to know you, because Julia was leaving town. She moved to Alaska to live with her son Shane and her grandsons and Shane's wife. She was pretty frail by then, but when she got to Alaska, she joined all the environmental and peace groups she could find. She was a member of the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy. And this is a clipping in December of '90. This is right before the first Gulf War. She went to a forum and testified against the war. She said, if, this is the first President Bush, if he is so hot on this war, he ought to send his sons. It was her last political protest. A couple months later, not even 2 months later, she had a major heart attack. I visited her there pretty quickly. I wanted to see her again. I knew Shane said she wasn't going to live very long. And she made him take us down to a peace demonstration in downtown Anchorage. They have one every Saturday. In fact, the visiting nurse came to see her that day, and the visiting nurse was late. And when the nurse finally got there, Julia said, "I'm sorry, we have to go to a peace demonstration. You'll have to come back another time." And we went down there, and of course she wasn't even well enough to get out of the car. She waited in the car where Shane and I went over, and it was just teeny. I mean, Anchorage is a military town anyway. But she had to be there. It was her heart. And she died in April. This is her grave. This is in Eugene with her parents. Some of her ashes are there, and some of her ashes are in Astoria, scattered on the grave of this radical feminist, Finnish feminist. She's got a hammer and sickle on her gravestone. And when Julia lived down there, the Red Finns asked her to tend that grave, put flowers on it Memorial Day. So Julia wanted some of her ashes there, so that's where we put them. Thank you. We've got time for questions or comments. Oh, and before we start, Julia's other great-grandson is here now. He was a little bit late because there was traffic. Ryan. Do you want to? Ryan Ruttila. I haven't seen these guys since a book release party, and that's like 8 years ago, so it's wonderful to see them. Okay, questions? Comments?
What's a red fin?
A red fin. Well, you know, there were white fins and red fins. The red fins were the communists, and the white fins were the conservatives. And then there was what Julia called the dancing fins. They were the apolitical ones. They had this huge Finnish community down there. They had the street signs were in Finnish, and they had 2 union halls, one for the white and one for the red. I'm sorry.
Wasn't it a big deal to get divorced back that many times back in the 40s?
I suppose so, but you know, Julia wasn't exactly what you would call part of polite society, I guess. I mean, she got married the first time, and she didn't tell me this. Her big brother her little brother told me this after she died. She got married when she was about 16, and that was annulled pretty shortly after. I'm not quite sure what that was about. And then she married Butch when she was about 19, and she left Butch, let's see. She left Butch, I brought my cheat sheet with me because it's been a while. She left Butch in, in 1940, and she said it was because he was an alcoholic and he was also running around on her. But she didn't divorce him until 1943, and but I think she only divorced him because she was marrying Ben Eaton. Those both happened in the same week. And she threw Ben out pretty early. She liked to say, and this is something I skipped because I was going overtime, was about racism in Oregon. There used to be white trade only signs in this city. And they were still there after the war when she married Ben. And she used to claim, Ben was a good union man, she would not have married him otherwise. She used to claim that they were out for dinner with his parents, and she saw the white trade only sign, and she said, "We have to leave," and Ben refused, and that she left him. And I said, "You mean you left the restaurant or you left him?" And she said, "I left him." He was a hypocrite. He was a good union man. How could he eat in this racist restaurant? Later on, I found out that he beat her up. And that was really when he beat her up, and he left the house, left her unconscious, she said. She probably was pretending to be unconscious, if I know Julia. And he left the house, and she packed up his stuff and put it on the front door, and out the front door. But she said she wasn't planning to get divorced because divorce was expensive. In 1950, I think she married Ben in 43, and I don't even think it lasted a year. I I don't have it. Oh, no. But she divorced him in 46. Irv paid for the divorce, Irv Goodman. She wasn't going to get divorced, but it was a good thing because then she met Oscar, and that was really a wonderful, she really, really had a wonderful marriage with Oscar to hear her talk about it. And then Oscar, very sadly, when he had a bad heart, and one morning he just died right there in the living room, the way some men do. So she moved back to Portland with Shane. She had taken in her grandson Shane and raised him. Yeah.
If there was a movie made of her life, who would you pick to play her?
Oh, wow. I've never thought about that. I actually had a fantasy, and I tried to get in touch with John Sayles, but you can't, they won't talk to you, these people, because they're afraid that you'll sue them later for the idea. I wanted to have a movie made about her going around taking these affidavits on the Ray Becker case. So I have thought about a movie about her, but I haven't thought about who. Somebody would have to be little. You know who that English actress who played the king's wife in the King's Speech? Huh? Yeah, I think she'd be good because she's little and she's dark and she's feisty. But that's just off the top of my head. I haven't ever really thought about it before. It's a great question. Yeah.
You know what she's looking at in that picture?
I don't. I've thought about that a lot. She's wearing, I don't. I thought about it maybe being a watch. But even in, the resolution's not so great there. But even in this, you can't really tell. I don't know. Sorry. Yes?
Well, I don't have a question. I just want to thank you. For her, for you, for us.
Okay. Yeah.
So of all of her proudest moments, which was the one that was?
Well, I think it's the Savi's Island.
Okay.
That's the one she said was the thing she was, the thing she was proudest of because it was the biggest achievement. Frankly, I think that the Ladies Auxiliary and the lockout and getting Ray Becker out are prouder achievements, but she never talked about them that way, so this was for her. Yeah.
So when you got to know her, that was for writing the book, and she knew you were going to write this book about it?
Well, how I got to know her was through the Northwest Women's History Project. We were making this show about the women who worked in the shipyards during World War II. This was back in 81. And Julia was on our board. I was aware of her. I actually met her. No, that's not true. I met her in 1966. I was involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and I met her in an organization called SNAP, Society for New Action Politics. I met her there. And I met Shane there. But I didn't really get to know her until she was on our board at the Northwest Women's History Project. And after we finished the show about the women, we had an all-day retreat with our board, all the women who worked on the show and all the women on our board, to talk about what our next project would be. The reality was that we never did another big project. But one of the things Julia brought up was that we ought to do something on the role of the Ladies Auxiliary in the lockout of 37. And one of the other women in the group and I, Tina Tao, and I went to interview Julia about it. And I had known about Julia for a long time. I knew about the Ray Becker thing. And there were a couple of other stories that she, how people have their story that they tell. But she never talked about the lockout. So that was my first realization that there was so much more there. And I had just learned how to do oral history working on the shipyard workers.
And so I decided on my own to go back and do this oral history with her. And initially, it was just that I wanted to get it. There's something that I always say, a lot of oral historians say, when somebody dies, it's like a library burns down. And so Julia, when I met her, she was only about 60, let me think. This was, well, she was a little older than 80. She was 73. But even when I met her when she was 59, I think, she wasn't very healthy. She had angina, she had asthma, she had arthritis. You know, I didn't know how long this woman would live. She lived into her 80s. She was like 83, which really is amazing given her health status. So I just started interviewing her, and it was just with the idea of getting in. And it was after I'd been interviewing her for quite some time that I thought I wasn't a writer. And I thought, oh my God, there's a book here. And then it was a rude awakening to me that you couldn't just put out the interview and that would be something people could read. So I spent a number of years becoming a writer, going to writing workshops, writing. That's why the book didn't come out until, 12 years after Julia died. So it took a long time.
What do you think she would have thought about it? Would she have been glad we wrote
She was
it?
very supportive. I gave her edits, you know, to read, and she liked them. She kept saying, "Stop wasting your time on my misspent life." But at the same time, she was very supportive. And yeah, and the whole family was supportive. They were all wonderful. They've always been wonderful. And I just asked Jason, he had to leave early because he works night, and then he had to go home and go to sleep before he goes to work at 1. But he, before I left, I said, you know, who's her literary executor? And he said, I don't know, I guess me. And I said, well, you know, I want to publish this other book about her. And he said, well, just get in touch, you know, you cannot do anything. They've just been so sweet to me, all of them. So Shane, very, very sadly, was in a car accident and died a few years ago. He was too young. Yeah.
Yes.
You've referred to a number of times to her, referring to her life as misspent. What do you think she would have viewed as a well-spent life?
Oh, I don't think she really meant it.
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, he said I referred to her a misspent life several times. Julia, what? Ryan, do you have anything you want to say?
She was very modest.
Yes, you're right. Part of that's modesty, but she was also. I meant, do you want to come up here and say anything? Feel free. She kind of exaggerated things. It wasn't kind of. She exaggerated things. She was wonderful, and she was marvelous, and she was effective, and she did good things, and she stuck with it. But she also kind of could go off on her own sometimes and be kind of foolish. Like one time they were, I can't remember why, they were doing an action against Nordstrom's. Maybe there was some kind of strike going on or something. And they went in, they were having a shoe in. They were going to go in and try on shoes and end up with all these shoes everywhere, right? And then just walk out. And Julia, they hadn't talked about this. Julia did this on her own. She put on a pair of heels, and she always wore what most of us would call old lady shoes. She put on this pair of heels and fell over. And I think she did it purposely. And she admitted afterwards that, then the store got nervous, and they sent her home in a cab, and they were all worried, and is she going to sue them, and blah, blah, blah. And in fact, I don't know if this is true, but she said they sent somebody out to the house to, see if she's all right. And Shane answered the door and said, oh, she's at a shoe-in at Nordstrom's. But she admitted it sort of ruined it sort of ended it, you know, that she would do these kind of flamboyant things. Now, I don't think that's what she meant by misspent. Misspent is probably what her brother would have called it. Her brother was very conservative, and he was a rocket scientist. He worked with Werner von Braun. I mean, it was just like, you know, they were not close. And her parents wanted her to, they were both college graduates. Her brother was a college graduate. Julia had 1 year of college, and then she got married, you know, and she established herself very firmly in the working class. So, I don't know, but I think Ryan's right, that it was a form of modesty, saying, you know, I'm no big deal. I really haven't done anything. But of course, this is only the tip of the iceberg that I talked to you tonight. She did a lot of other things too. So, yeah.
Read the book when it comes out.
The book is out. Huh?
The one you haven't written.
Oh, well, the other book I want to do is some of Julia's unpublished or unavailable things. She wrote this novel about this young girl whose father works in the mill in Linton, and whose family, you know, she's part of that family, and who falls in love with management. And but that novel was never published, and she has some short stories. She won a contest when she was in college with a short story, a long short story, and she did an article about Astoria when she was living there. That was published, but of course it's not available now. It was published in a little communist magazine. But it's really good. And so I'd like to put together a little collection like that, and hopefully in the next couple of years it'll come out. I think it would be something people would enjoy. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned this was her proudest moment, and I think I got it, but what is the moment you think she should be most proud of? What is it?
I think the Ladies Auxiliary and maybe Ray Becker. And all her journalism. You know, she had an enormous amount of journalism. She was an activist for 50 years. From that, when they founded that union, they started working on it in 1934, and she retired in 1987. It's really 53 years. I think pretty proud of that. A journalist almost all that time, an activist all that time. She really touched a lot of people. Yeah. Well, thank you all very much.